Welcome to the third episode of the Wingate Way. In this episode, we had a very interesting conversation with Dr. Geniece Monde, Professor of Sociology and Criminal Justice here at Wingate University. She talked about growing up in Queens and all the diversity that was part of her childhood, celebrating American holidays with Jamaican parents, as well as all the things that she finds so fulfilling about working with students and working at this institution. You don't want to miss this third episode of the Wingate Way. Dr. Monde, thank you for joining us for this third episode of the Wingate Way. For those who don't know you, tell us a little bit more about yourself. What's your story?
So I came to Wingate University in 2013. I was hired in the Department of Sociology. I am a sociologist by training, and I also teach criminal justice courses here at the university.
Okay. And how did you decide on Wingate? How did you arrive here?
So towards the end of graduate school, I applied for jobs, which is a pretty normal process for academics. And I noticed that Wingate had a posting for a job opportunity, and it seemed to very much fit in line with my interests, both research as well as teaching. And I applied to the job. I was able to visit the university, come to a campus visit in January of 2013. And I had a really good visit. I really enjoyed meeting potential future colleagues. And fortunately, I was given an offer, and I readily and happily accepted.
Okay. And what are some of the key factors that really help you make the decision that Wingate was the place for you to teach?
So one of the things I really appreciated about Wingate before applying, I didn't just see the job posting and applied. I went to the website, learned a bit about the history, the cultural norms of the university, and I really like the focus on faith, knowledge, and of course, service. And for me, having that mission in mind for a primarily undergraduate population was ideal. I knew pretty early on in graduate school that I wanted to devote myself to a teaching-focused institution, and knowing that that was a primary goal of Wingate University definitely helped the job appear really attractive to me. And then coupled with the idea of faith, knowledge, and service, ideas that I valued personally as well as professionally, definitely helped encourage me to apply to the job as well. And so I remember talking about that in my cover letter as I applied for the job, discussing how I thought faith integrated with how I thought about my work as a scholar, and that was reaffirmed by coming here and speaking to faculty members as well. So that was definitely something that I think set Wingate apart from other institutions that I had visited.
Yeah, you mentioned faith, knowledge, and service. You know, having such an impact on your decision to being here, and those things being things that you also valued as an individual. Where do you attribute having faith and this idea of serving others as personal values? What do you attribute it to?
I think that anything that you do in life, any work that you do, any relationships that you have, pretty much all of our existence, there are obstacles that are going to be embedded with those experiences, even really good experiences. Right. And I think it's important to have a higher purpose in calling for whatever those relationships happen to be. What is this for? Why am I here? Those are questions that I think we often ask ourselves. Sometimes they're really broad and existential, like why am I on earth? But sometimes they're much more narrow. You know, why am I taking this class? Why am I choosing to major in this subject? And I think having the ability to connect that with something broader is important. And that's something that for me, I grappled with, particularly as a college student. I asked myself those questions constantly, and the ability to connect it to serving other people, to my faith, helped me to look at those challenges, look at those issues through a renewed lens. Okay. And so as a college professor, those are things I think about. I think about serving students within, of course, the capacity of a professor teaching, but realizing that students have complex experiences, they have challenges that they face, and how can I be understanding and approach those challenges when they arise, and balancing that also with the expectations that I have for them, making sure that they're readily prepared, because not everyone is going to approach them in that way. So balancing, you know, who I am, my faith in my students, my faith in God, my faith in our institutions, with this broader sense of serving the people that I'm assigned to serve for a particular period in life, whether it's my students, my colleagues, or outside of the university setting.
Okay, great. And then you mentioned that you are a sociology professor. Did you always know that you wanted to be a teacher? If not, what did you think you were going to be when you were growing up?
So much of my life, I thought I was going to be a physician, okay, a pediatrician. Did not even know what sociology was until I went to college. So I definitely cannot say that that's what I always aspired to be. When I realized that being a physician, the idea of serving, because I did have a very strong service-oriented desire connected to being a physician, was there, but I didn't necessarily want to express it through that particular vocation. Okay. I did think about teaching. I considered teaching, different levels of teaching, K through 12, or you know, younger. And for me, I felt that I was really inspired by my college professors. I was inspired by the questions that they posed, the challenges that were raised. And for me, I knew that if I were going to teach, I wanted it to be at the university level. Okay. And I was majoring in sociology. By the middle of college, I really enjoyed questions. I really enjoyed unpacking or unearthing truths that dispelled preconceived notions of how the way the world worked. And for me, it was really exciting to couple that with teaching, basically doing what my professors were doing. That seemed like a really appealing life to lead, and a life of the mind, where you're asking questions constantly and you are challenging people to ask questions, your students to ask questions. And so that really was something that was fostered in me during my collegiate years.
Okay. And for us to get a broader sense of how you are right here and who you are, tell us a little bit more about your childhood and your parents and family life.
Well, I was born in Jamaica, West Indies, and I arrived here when I was still pretty young, so all of my memories and experiences are in the United States. I grew up in New York, Queens, New York to be specific, and my parents, they came here to the United States in their 20s. And so we lived in Queens pretty much the entirety of my formative years up through the time I went away to college. I had one sibling, I have a sister, and it was really interesting growing up in Queens. At the time, you take for granted where you are because that's all that you know, but Queens is one of the most diverse places in the country. There's a particular area of Queens that I think it's the most diverse zip code in the United States. Wow. And so you have this melting pot of different cultures, languages, and for me that, you know, I wasn't thinking about that time, but that has, as an adult, definitely helped me to appreciate my role as a sociologist, appreciate the diverse experiences, narratives of people coming from all walks of life, all backgrounds. And growing up and learning about different traditions, American traditions, but seeing how it manifested, or those things were manifested in my household, was insightful. So the way we celebrated holidays, for example, was different from the presentation of how that holiday was celebrated on television in mainstream society. And those were things that I was able to appreciate as being distinctive, but also beautiful, and something that to this day I'm very proud of, and I do carry on in my own home, in how we celebrate certain holidays and how we conceptualize and think about certain holidays and practices, making sure that my culture is infused within those experiences.
Well, can you share with us a typical holiday or one holiday in particular that for us to get a sense of how you all were able to integrate your cultural heritage with the culture of your host nation, if you will?
Okay, so Christmas is, it's a religious holiday, but it's broadly secularized, so even people who aren't necessarily devout celebrate Christmas. So it's a pretty popular holiday, of course, within the United States, and many places in the Western Hemisphere and beyond, of course. So we eat certain foods during Christmas that are kind of specific to people from the Caribbean. So one example is there's a cake that we make that my mom particularly makes. It's called black cake. We sometimes use the term fruit cake, but we tend to lean towards black cake because fruit cake here in the United States is something completely different. It looks completely different, tastes completely different. It's black cake, there's rum in it, it's a very rich, dense cake. We have a drink called sorrel that's made by boiling these particular types of leaves, and we drink that with the cake. That's something that's distinctive, right? But that's also something that's very closely tied to Christmas, right? The foods that we eat, if I were to think of Thanksgiving, for example, I never much cared for turkey. My mom made it. That's not a holiday in Jamaica, but that was part of assimilation. So we'd have a turkey, but what everyone wanted was oxtail and curried goat and all these other dishes that, again, were very much connected to our culture and our heritage that were distinct in that way, for us and people more broadly in the Caribbean. And so those, for me, were normal. Those, I was like, okay, everyone does this, right? But everyone doesn't do that, right? There are people who infuse their own cultural traditions within their, within specific holidays. And then there are some who have stereotypical mainstream expressions of that, and it varies. But I think for me, realizing that there's beauty in all of it is valuable, and just thinking about the diversity of food is kind of one way I think about the diversity of other experiences within our society.
So you talked a lot about, obviously your rich cultural heritage, growing up in Queens with the diversity that you were surrounded with. So how have those things shape the way you view the world, shape the way you approach the classroom, the teaching, the things that you want your student to experience or understand?
Well, I know students come from all walks of life and all backgrounds. There are students, many students, in fact, for example, who are first-generation students, whether they were born here or born somewhere else. And there are distinct challenges that one faces when you're a first-generation student. Feeling or trying to feel like you belong, right? Trying to acclimate yourself to the environment. And I don't call students out in, a public setting like a classroom, but sometimes students will come to me and mention certain challenges that they face and where those challenges stem from. And I can identify with some of the things they mention. And I'll sometimes share my own story, because it can be isolating if you feel that you're the only one or one of the few, and you're trying to figure things out. Everyone knows, and you don't want to ask because you don't want to seem like, oh, I don't know, then everyone's going to think I don't know. And we get wrapped up in our own insecurity. And I think when you have someone who is in a position of seeming authority, like a professor, and they say, I didn't know certain things as well. I wasn't a first-generation college student, but I was the first to go to the university in the United States. So there are certain processes that I still had to navigate because my parents were educated outside of the country, and there were certain expectations attached to that as well. And so being able to share with students how I struggled, how I challenged certain notions of what is expected, and how it kind of works out, I think can be encouraging. And so I think we empower other people when we share our own stories. And as a professor, I think being able to share a story makes your student feel that they don't have to have it all together right then and there, because we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to have it all together, especially if we're comparing ourselves to other people. And I like students to be able to think that, oh, well, my professor didn't know what she was doing when she was my age, and so maybe it's okay that I'm not completely certain of where I'm going and what my trajectory will look like. So I do like to think about that as I'm sharing with students who are facing certain challenges or grappling with decisions about what to major in and who to become later on in life.
And I know you mentioned that, you know, at some point in time you thought you were going to be a physician, and that almost halfway through your college career you realized that perhaps sociology was the best place to go. And I'm sure we have so many students that maybe come as undeclared or come with a predefined idea of what they want to do and are forced to make that shift or forced to make that choices. And I know it's not easy.
Right.
So what would you say your younger self, knowing what you know now, about how to handle that decision and that transition, and that perhaps a student that is going through something similar or is thinking about making that shift could benefit from?
You don't have to have it all together. The idea that we will know who we will become when we're 20 is ridiculous, right? But that's how we think about things. And our well-meaning and loving and nurturing parents or guardians, what have you, kind of want that as well. They're investing, you know, significant sums of money, time, effort, and energy, even before you started college, towards that goal. And so there's a lot of pressure to feel that we have to know what we will be, and we have to make everyone proud. But making people proud and making yourself proud doesn't mean you have to have it all together right away, right? So you want to be able to ask that question and think about, if I do this for the benefit of others, can I do this for 10 years? Can I do this for 5 years? Is it better for me to pivot? Is it better for me to ask questions, to sit down with professors, to kind of explore the challenges that I'm facing now, and then make a shift that can have ramifications, positive ramifications later on, or for me to continue down this trajectory that I'm miserable on, right? And that was a question that I asked myself. And once I embraced the idea that I wanted to be something else, it was freeing, it was liberating. It was not without its challenges, but ultimately I don't regret it at all. It's okay, you are not a failure. That is definitely something I know a lot of students will grapple with, a lot of people, adults, you know, a lot of us grapple with, like, oh, I'm giving up, right? That was something that I struggled with. I'm giving up. I said I was going to do this. Everyone knows that I'm going to do this. And now I'm saying I'm not going to do this. I'm giving up. And then we connect that to failure or success. And that really is a destructive way to think about that. You're changing. You're changing, right? A caterpillar is not a failure because it becomes a butterfly, right? It's evolved into something else. And something many times that's more beautiful because it naturally suits where you are and where you should be in that particular season. So embrace those changes and don't feel like you're beholden to the expectations you set for yourself when you were 16 or something, or that other people have set for you.
Yeah, well, that's beautifully said, and I'm sure a lot of students and people in general will appreciate almost the reassurance and almost the permission to not have it all figured out and to just give into that evolving process of becoming. So I know sociology has multiple branches and multiple specialization. Like, which one did you pick and why did you arrive at that choice? Why were you so interested in that particular branch of sociology?
So sociologists have a lot of different areas of interest, so it's hard for us to narrow it down, and that's one of the reasons I chose sociology as a discipline. But in terms of what my area of focus eventually became, I was interested and am interested in issues of gender and crime.
Okay.
I particularly focused on women who had been incarcerated. So they were formerly incarcerated and they were reuniting with their children. But really, at the broader sense, I'm interested in people who are on the margins of society. So I've written about topics and issues that aren't connected to incarceration, but they are connected to people who are stigmatized in some way. I'm really fascinated with how do people who, because of some aspect of their identity, it could be their race, their status as parents, their criminal histories, whatever it is, are pushed to the margins of society. They're what sociologists call marked, right? Yeah. They're labeled based on this particular experience. How do they navigate that process? And at the level of service, I think about how do I and how do we as a society either encourage and support them being marginalized, or discourage that and bring them into spaces. And thinking about, inclusion and being welcoming to people from all walks of life. And so I think about those because it's easy to not think about people who are on the outside because they're on the outside, right? But their voices matter. Their experiences are distinct. And we can often learn a lot from those experiences. And I think writing people off because they've had challenges at some level does a disservice, not just to them, but to us in society, because we're all here. We can put blinders on and ignore certain people, but they are here and they are a part of our society and our story.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I know as a university, we pride ourselves in trying to create an inclusive environment for not just the students, but for the people that work here. Mm-hmm. From your personal perspective and professional perspective, of course, where do you think we are successful, and what are some of the gaps that are still left to be filled, and some of the things that not only as an institution we could do, but individual within the community can do to help uplift that idea of inclusion and diversity?
Well, with inclusion and diversity, I think one of the challenges that many institutions face, not just our institution, is that we can often focus on making sure we're doing something and we are promoting the idea, and less so on the real practical ways that we're including people from the very populations that we're trying to reach. Okay, so it's a buzzword, right? If you're a university or if you're a Fortune 500 company, you have to have something there that says something about diversity and inclusion. But you don't just want it to be a word, right? You don't want it just to be a catchphrase. You want to be reflexive about it. In sociology, we have something called reflexive sociology. And what that means is you recognize your position, sometimes of privilege, and what that means for how you'll approach a certain issue, right? So if I am not from a diverse background, be it race, gender, or economic, whatever demographic you're trying to reach, that might skew in some ways how I then approach what I genuinely want to address, right? And so the best way to address it is not to think, well, I'm really smart, so I'll be able to figure this out, right? The best way to go about that is to invite people to the table who are from those particular backgrounds and have them share with you what those gaps are, because I can guarantee without doing that, you're going to miss something, right? If I am interested in addressing an issue related to ableness, right? And the shortcomings of addressing someone with physical disabilities, I am going to miss something if I am not including the voices of someone who is either disabled him or herself, or someone who has spent significant time caring for, or reaching out to people within that population.
Yeah.
There's just no way I'm going to be able to capture that.
Yeah.
Experience is truly valuable. Reading is important. I'm an academic, I love to read, but lived experience is also really meaningful. So I think it's important to have those voices included. And so as an institution, when you're thinking about that issue, you want to say, who's discussing this issue?
Yeah.
Does everyone, is anyone from that demographic that we're trying to reach? And if that's not the case, then you want to think, okay, well, what can we do, right, to change this? Are we potentially missing something? And like I said, you probably are, well-meaning though you might be.
Yeah.
Now, specific to university, you definitely want to make sure that you're hearing from students. So I don't think that, whether it's an office, a formal office of diversity inclusion, or someone who embodies that position, a diversity officer or what have you, I don't think that everyone at the table should be administrators. Okay. I don't even think everyone at the table should be administrators and faculty. There should be students there because the university is for students. It's not for administration. If no one enrolled in Wingate University, the university would fall apart. If someone leaves an administration position, even a fairly high-ranking position, we'd there'd be a search committee, we'd get someone to replace that person, but the university, by and large, would function. The same thing with a faculty member. So we want to make sure that the voices of students are included. And so we want diversity not just in terms of how it looks, in terms of background, but also the levels that comprise the university: students, faculty, administrators addressing these issues head on.
Yeah, this notion from what I hear you say is this notion of really trying to be a little bit more proactive about those issues.
Right.
As opposed to, something happens, then we try to address and support the people that were affected.
Right, because oftentimes then you're playing catch up.
Yeah.
Right, and you don't want to play catch up. We've seen examples of that happen at other universities, and it could be, there are varying degrees of how detrimental it could be, and you don't really want that to happen. It's optimistic, but somewhat naive to think, well, that will never happen here. We're not like those schools. And prayerfully, that is in fact the case. But if something were to happen, you want students, if we're thinking about a student issue, to have a place of recourse within the university. Because when that doesn't happen, what often happens and what we've seen in cases is that students are like, there's no place here of recourse, so I'm going to go elsewhere, and then it becomes greatly publicized.
Yep. Social media typically is where.
Right, exactly. So you want students to have a voice, and then you also want, when those issues are addressed, that there is support. People who are trained in that support, because just recently, I won't, mention the institution, there was a complaint that was made, and the approach by the administrator was really tone deaf, right? And I'm not talking about, this is not here, this is somewhere else, but the approach was tone deaf, and it was highly publicized just this past weekend. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you're an academic, you may be an administrator, but you don't have the perspective to realize that saying something along those lines and addressing students in a certain way might be perceived as offensive. And so it's important to have someone there ready on campus who's trained, that when you hear something, you're not sure how to respond, you can say, go to that colleague and say, I've heard about this, how should I respond? And they could say, don't address it this way. That will be a problem, right? This is a better way to address those issues. And I think that would save a lot of institutions a lot of stress and hand-wringing.
And and I know we talked a lot about the responsibility of the institution, but for us as individuals, as part of the community, what can we do at our level to create and foster an environment that is inclusive and welcoming to all?
I think listening is important. It sounds really simple, but people hear, but that's not the same thing as listening. To the diverse perspectives. Now, as a faculty member, that's going to happen fairly often because you ask questions and you try to ask sometimes controversial questions, not to be intentionally, to create an acrimonious classroom environment, but you want students to be aware of the fact that the world is broader than the world that maybe they came from. And so you ask questions and you hear diverse experiences, and you then connect those experiences to stories and narratives and research that they may not have been aware of, right? When you're dealing one-on-one with a student, right? You make sure that they're seen and they're heard. Never dismiss, and that's, that can be oftentimes, unfortunately, a source of grief. Dismiss a student because they're from a certain background, right? Maybe they don't have the language, right, to articulate how they're feeling about a particular issue. But keep in mind that they don't have the life experience that you have, right? Hearing them, listening to them, more importantly, and then being conscientious of how you go about addressing those issues. And the same thing applies with our colleagues as well, right? I think our university is very collegial. I've had good experiences, but it's always important to be mindful and check ourselves. And like I said before, being reflexive and thinking about, are there certain embedded biases that I have that might make me more likely to listen to this voice than this other voice? And if that's the case, why is that, right? Can I change that? That's not easy work, but it's much better for us to take that upon ourselves than for other people to point that out, because we don't want when someone else points that out for us. And so it's important to think about making sure we're listening to diverse experiences, not assuming things about other people because of their cultural background, right? Many times people inadvertently say offensive things about people because they're of a certain religion, certain racial or ethnic background. They make assumptions about who they are, and you never want to do that. Tell me about this is a good way to start a question, not, oh, you must be like this then because you're from that background. That is not a good way to go about trying to draw a connection, even if the intent is pretty innocuous. You can close the door for bridging gaps in conversation by assumptions about someone that you really don't know, right?
I mean, the intent doesn't always guarantee the impact, right? And
right.
Ultimately, the impact is what matters. So, for those of us who just love this place and love living here, studying here, working here, and teaching here, we know there are so many wonderful things about this place that sometimes feels intangible. It feels impossible to quite articulate. And I think that's part of the reason we created this show called the Wingate Way. So how will you tell somebody about this place, about what makes this institution great, and maybe somebody who may be interested to come work here, or a student that heard of us and want to know more? What would you say makes this place unique and wonderful?
Well, I can only speak from my experience. Someone might have a different experience, but I felt welcomed here by my colleagues. I felt comfortable being able to ask questions about things that I didn't know. I never felt that there was this cutthroat environment that someone didn't want to ask a question because they didn't want me to undercut their climb to success or anything like that. And you hear these horror stories when you're a graduate student about infighting and backbiting and all sorts of things. And for me, that hasn't been my personal experience. As a faculty, in terms of faculty-student relations, I've really been impressed by students who just genuinely want to learn. And that's the spectrum of academic ability, if you will, initial ability, because I think students might come in not being maybe the strongest students or not feeling confident about their strength as a student academically, but wanting to truly succeed, right? Whatever success means for them, and being able to help direct them along that trajectory. So at the level of working here, I think there is a collegiality. I feel that there is, we're in a very small town. I feel that emanates to some extent in our university, this closeness there. we're not this large decentralized institution where you never see anyone. You know people from across the campus, people in other departments, people from other schools, and people in administrative positions that, you know, at a much larger institution, you may simply not be able to develop that rapport because of the size and scope. And so having that ability, I think, is something that I value greatly. And something I would definitely encourage someone to think about as well.
Yeah. So it's been obvious throughout this conversation how passionate you are about making sure that you create an inclusive environment for your students, fighting for those who are marginalized, uplifting and bringing, you know, front and center difficult conversations about who we are as people and some of the tensions that may exist between races, whether in the US or in the world. When you're not busy doing all those things, what do you do for fun? What do you do when you're not out there trying to support students and help them succeed?
I love reading. Outside of my discipline, learning about information and issues that may not be connected directly to what I study and what I teach, but I love expanding my body of knowledge. I love spending time with my family, and that, of course, takes up a significant part of my time outside of work, because that's an investment as well, an important investment and a lifelong investment. And so for me, just spending time with friends and spending time with family and eating. I love eating. I mentioned food earlier on, but I think there are interesting things you can learn by eating food from different cultures and trying different places. And so I usually will kind of think of a place or a spot, or if I'm listening to a food review or a restaurant review on the radio, I'll jot that down and like visit the place when I have free time. And those are, you know, pretty simply. I can't quite travel the world with, you know, a 3-year-old right now. But I hope to be able to then expand my interest of different cultures and do that more, travel more regularly once, you know, I have older children. But yeah, friends and family and reading and food and art and theater. I didn't mention that. I love theater. I got to see Hamilton. I was super excited when they came to Charlotte.
Okay.
Yeah, and yeah, just learning. I mean, all of it is connected in many ways to learning and being present. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your time. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with the rest of the world.